by the first lady or gentleman who went through. The first lady who went through had a roll of music, half in her muff and half out of it, and was in such a tumbled condition altogether that it seemed as if it would be an act of kindness to iron her. But as she was very good-natured and said, "Come with me, I'll soon find Miss Dorrit for you," Miss Dorrit's sister went with her, drawing nearer and nearer at every step she took in the darkness to the sound of music and the sound of dancing feet. At last they came into a maze of dust, where a quantity of people were tumbling over one another, and where there was such a confusion of unaccountable shapes of beams, bulkheads, brick walls, ropes, and rollers, and such a mixing of gaslight and daylight, that they seemed to have got on the wrong side of the pattern of the universe. Little Dorrit, left to herself, and knocked against by somebody every moment, was quite bewildered, when she heard her sister's voice. "Why, good gracious, Amy, whatever brought you here?" "I wanted to see you, Fanny, dear, and as I'm going out all day tomorrow, and knew you might be engaged all day today, I thought—" "But the idea, Amy, of you coming behind! I never did." As her sister said this in no very cordial tone of welcome, she conducted her to a more open part of the maze, where various golden chairs and tables were heaped together, and where a number of young ladies were sitting on anything they could find, chattering. All these young ladies wanted ironing, and all had a curious way of looking everywhere while they chattered. Just as the sisters arrived here, a monotonous boy in a Scotch cap put his head round the beam on the left and said, "Less noise there, ladies," and disappeared. Immediately after which a sprightly gentleman with a quantity of long black hair looked round a beam on the right and said, "Less noise there, darlings," and also disappeared. "The notion of you among professionals, Amy, is really the last thing I could have conceived," said her sister. "Why, how did you ever get here?" "I don't know. The lady who told you I was here was so good as to bring me in." "Like you quiet little things. You can make your way anywhere, I believe. I couldn't have managed it, Amy, though I know so much more of the world." It was the family custom to lay it down as family law that she was a plain domestic little creature without the great and sage experience of the rest. This family fiction was the family assertion of itself against her services, not to make too much of them. "Well, and what have you got on your mind, Amy? Of course you've got something on your mind about me," said Fanny. She spoke as if her sister, between 2 and 3 years her junior, were her prejudiced grandmother. "It's not much, but since you told me of the lady who gave you the bracelet, Fanny—" The monotonous boy put his head round the beam on the left and said, "Look out there, ladies," and disappeared. The sprightly gentleman with the black hair has suddenly put his head round the beam on the right and said, "Look out there, darlings," and also disappeared. Thereupon all the young ladies rose and began shaking their skirts out behind. "Well, Amy," said Fanny, doing as the rest did, "what were you going to say?" "Since you told me a lady had given you the bracelet you showed me, Fanny, I have not been quite easy on your account, and indeed want to know a little more if you will confide more to me." "Now, ladies," said the boy in the Scotch cap. "Now, darlings," said the gentleman with the black hair. They were every one gone in a moment, and the music and the dancing feet were heard again. Little Dorrit sat down in a golden chair, made quite giddy by these rapid interruptions. Her sister and the rest were a long time gone, and during their absence a voice, it appeared to be that of the gentleman with the black hair, was continually calling out through the music, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, go! 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, go! Steady, darlings! 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, go! Ultimately the voice stopped, and they all came back again, more or less out of breath, folding themselves in their shawls and making ready for the streets. "Stop a moment, Amy, and let them get away before us," whispered Fanny. They were soon left alone, nothing more important happening in the meantime than the boy looking round his old beam and saying, "Everybody at 11 tomorrow, ladies," and the gentleman with the black hair looking round his old beam and saying, "Everybody at 11 tomorrow, darlings." each in his own accustomed manner. When they were alone, something was rolled up or by other means got out of the way, and there was a great empty well before them, looking down into the depths of which Fanny said, "Now, uncle." Little Dorrit, as her eyes became used to the darkness, faintly made out at the bottom of the well, in an obscure corner by himself, with his instrument in his ragged case under his arm. The old man looked as if the remote high gallery windows, with their little strip of sky, might have been the point of his better fortunes, from which he had descended, until he had gradually sunk down below there to the bottom. He had been in that place 6 nights a week for many years, but had never observed to raise his eyes above his music book, and was confidently believed to have never seen a play. There were legends in the place that he did not so much as know the popular heroes and heroines by sight, and that the low comedian had mugged at him in his richest manner 50 nights for a wager, and he had shown no trace of consciousness. The carpenters had a joke to the effect that he was dead without being aware of it, and the frequenters of the pit supposed him to pass his whole life, night and day, and Sunday and all, in the orchestra. They had tried him a few times with pinches of snuff offered over the rails, and he had always responded to this attention with a momentary waking up of a manner that had the pale phantom of a gentleman in it. Beyond this, he never, on any occasion, had any other part in what was going on than the part written out for the clarionet. In private life, where there was no part for the clarionet, he had no part at all. Some said he was poor, some said he was a wealthy miser, but he had said nothing, never lifted up his bowed head, never varied his shuffling gait by getting his springless foot from the ground. Though expecting now to be summoned by his niece, he did not hear her until she had spoken to him 3 or 4 times. Nor was he at all surprised by the presence of 2 nieces instead of 1, but merely said in his tremulous voice, I'm coming, and crept forth by some underground way which emitted a cellarous smell. "And so, Amy," said her sister, when the 3 together passed out at the door that had such a shame-faced consciousness of being different from the other doors, the uncle instinctively taking Amy's arm as the arm to be relied on, "So, Amy, you are curious about me." She was pretty and conscious and rather flaunting, and the condescension with which she put aside the superiority of her charms and of her worldly experience, and addressed her sister on almost equal terms, had a vast deal of the family in it. "I am interested, Fanny, and concerned in anything that concerns you." So you are, and you are the best of Amys. If I am ever a little provoking, I'm sure you'll consider what a thing it is to occupy my position and feel a consciousness of being superior to it. I shouldn't care," said the daughter of the father of the Marshalsea, "if the others were not so common. None of them had come down in the world as we have. They are all on their own level. Common." Little Dorrit mildly looked at the speaker, but did not interrupt her. Fanny took out her handkerchief and rather angrily wiped her eyes. "I was not born when you were, you know, Amy, and perhaps that makes a difference. My dear child, when we get rid of Uncle, you shall know all about it. We'll drop him at the cook's shop where he is going to dine." They walked on with him until they came to a dirty shop window in a dirty street, which was made almost opaque by the steam of hot meats, vegetables, and puddings. But glimpses were to be caught of a roast leg of pork bursting into tears of sage and onion in a metal reservoir full of gravy, of an unctuous piece of roast beef and blisterous Yorkshire pudding, bubbling hot in a similar receptacle, of a stuffed fillet of veal in rapid cut, of a ham in a perspiration with the place it was going at, of a shallow tank of baked potatoes glued together by their own richness, of a truss or 2 of boiled greens, and other substantial delicacies. Within were a few wooden partitions, behind which such customers as found it more convenient to take away their dinners in stomachs than in their hands, packed their purchases in solitude. Fanny, opening her reticule, as they surveyed these things, produced from that repository a shilling, and handed it to Uncle. Uncle, after not looking at it a little while, divined its object, and muttering, "Dinner, Ah, yes, 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 slowly vanished from them into the mist. "Now, Amy," said her sister, "come with me, if you are not too tired to walk to Harley Street, Cavendish Square." The air with which she threw off this distinguished address, and the toss she gave to her new bonnet, which was more gauzy than serviceable, made her sister wonder. However, she expressed her readiness to go to Harley Street, and thither they directed their steps. Arrived at that grand destination, Fanny singled out the handsomest house, and knocking at the door, inquired for Mrs. Myrtle. The footman who opened the door, although he had powder on his head, and was backed up by two other footmen likewise powdered, not only admitted Mrs. Myrtle to be at home, but asked Fanny to walk in. Fanny walked in, taking her sister with her, and they went upstairs, with powder going before and powder stopping behind, and were left in a spacious semicircular drawing-room, one of several drawing-rooms, where there was a parrot on the outside of a golden cage, holding on by its beak, with its scaly legs in the air, and putting itself into many strange upside-down postures. This peculiarity has been observed in birds of quite another feather, climbing upon golden wires. The room was far more splendid than anything little Dorrit had ever imagined, and would have been splendid and costly in any eyes. She looked in amazement at her sister, and would have asked a question, but the Fanny, with a warning frown, pointed to a curtained doorway of communication with another room. The curtain shook next moment, and a lady, raising it with a heavily ringed hand, dropped it behind her again as she entered. The lady was not young and fresh from the hand of nature, but was young and fresh from the hand of her maid. She had large, unfeeling, handsome eyes, and dark, unfeeling, handsome hair, and a broad, unfeeling, handsome bosom, and was made the most of in every particular. Either because she had a cold, or because it suited her face, she wore a rich white fillet tied over her head and under her chin. And if ever there was an unfeeling, handsome chin that looked as if, for certain, it had ever been, in familiar parlance, chucked by the hand of man, it was the chin curbed up so tight and close by that laced bridle. "Mrs. Myrtle," said Fanny. "My sister, ma'am." "I am glad to see your sister, Miss Dorrit. I did not remember that you had a sister." "I did not mention that I had," said Fanny. "Ah." Mrs. Myrtle curled the little finger of her left hand, as who should say, "I have caught you. I know you didn't." All her action was usually with her left hand, because her hands were not a pair, and left being much the whiter and plumper of the two. Then she added, "Sit down," and composed herself voluptuously in a nest of crimson and gold cushions on an ottoman near the parrot. "Also professional?" said Mrs. Myrtle, looking at little Dorrit through an eyeglass. Fanny answered, "No." "No," said Mrs. Myrtle, dropping her glass. "Has not a professional air. Very pleasant, but not professional." "My sister, ma'am," said Fanny, in whom there was a singular mixture of deference and hardihood, "has been asking me to tell her, as between sisters, how I came to have the honour of knowing you, and as I had engaged to call upon you once more, I thought I might take the liberty of bringing her with me, when perhaps you would tell her. I wish her to know, and perhaps you will tell her." "Do you think at your sister's age?" hinted Mrs. Myrtle. "She is much older than she looks," said Fanny, "almost as old as I am." "Society," said Mrs. Myrtle, with another curve of her little finger, "is so difficult to explain to young persons. Indeed, it is so difficult to explain to most persons, that I am glad to hear that. I wish society was not so arbitrary. I wish it was not so exacting. Bird, be quiet." The parrot had given a most piercing shriek, as if its name was society, and it asserted its right to its exactions. "But," resumed Mrs. Myrtle, "we must take it as we find it. We know it is hollow and conventional and worldly and very shocking, but unless we are savages in the tropical seas, I should have been charmed to be one myself. Most delightful life and perfect climate, I am told. We must consult it. It is the common lot. Mr. Myrtle is a most extensive merchant. His transactions are on the vastest scale. His wealth and influence are very great. But even he— Bird, be quiet. The parrot had shrieked another shriek, and it filled up the sentence so expressively that Mrs. Myrtle was under no necessity to end it. Since your sister begs that I would terminate our personal acquaintance, she began again, addressing little Dorrit, by relating the circumstances that are much to her credit, I cannot object to comply with her request. I am sure I have a son. I was first married extremely young, of 2 or 23. Fanny set her lips, and her eyes looked half triumphantly at her sister. A son of 2 or 23. He is a little gay at things society is accustomed to in young men, and he is very impressible. Perhaps he inherits that misfortune. I am very impressible myself by nature. The weakest of creatures. My feelings are touched in a moment. She said all this and everything else as coldly as a woman of snow, quite forgetting the sisters except at odd times, and apparently addressing some abstraction of society, for whose behoof, too, she occasionally arranged her dress or the composition of her figure upon the ottoman. So he is very impressible. Not a misfortune in our natural state, I dare say, but we are not in a natural state. Much to be lamented, no doubt, particularly by myself, who am a child of nature if I could but show it, but so it is. Society suppresses us and dominates us. Bird, be quiet. The parrot had broken into a violent fit of laughter, after twisting divers bars of his cage with his crooked bill, and licking them with his black tongue. It is quite unnecessary to say to a person of your good sense, wide range of experience and cultivated feeling, said Mrs. Myrtle from her nest of crimson and gold, and there put up a glass to refresh her memory as to whom she was addressing, that the stage sometimes has a fascination for young men of that class of character. In saying the stage, I mean the people on it of the female sex. Therefore, when I heard that my son was supposed to be fascinated by a dancer, I knew what that usually meant in society, and confided in her being a dancer at the opera, where young men moving in society are usually fascinated. She passed her white hands over one another, observant of the sisters now, and the rings upon her fingers grated against each other with a hard sound. As your sister will tell you, when I found what the theatre was, I was much surprised and much distressed. But when I found that your sister, by rejecting my son's advances, I must add in an unexpected manner, had brought him to the point of proposing marriage, my feelings were of the profoundest anguish, acute. She traced the outline of her left eyebrow and put it right. In a distracted condition which only a mother moving in society can be susceptible of, I determined to go myself to the theatre and represent my state of mind to the dancer. I made myself known to your sister. I found her, to my surprise, in many respects different from my expectations, and certainly in none more so than in meeting with me, what shall I say, a sort of family assertion on her own part. Mrs. Myrtle smiled. I told you, ma'am, said Fanny, with a heightening colour, that although you found me in that situation, I was so far above the rest that I considered my family as good as your son's, and that I had a brother who, knowing the circumstances, would be of the same opinion, and would not consider such a connection any honour. Miss Dorrit, said Mrs. Myrtle, after frostily looking at her through her glass, precisely what I was on the point of telling your sister in pursuance of your request. Much obliged to you for recalling it so accurately and anticipating me. I immediately, addressing little Dorrit, for I am the creature of impulse, took a bracelet from my arm and begged your sister to let me clasp it on hers, in token of the delight I had in our being able to approach the subject so far on a common footing. This was perfectly true, the lady having brought a cheap and showy article on her way to the interview, with a general eye to bribery. And I told you, Mrs. Myrtle, said Fanny, that we might be unfortunate, but we are not common. I think the very words, Miss Dorrit, assented Mrs. Myrtle. And I told you, Mrs. Myrtle, said Fanny, that if you spoke to me of the superiority of your son's standing in society, it was barely possible that you rather deceived yourself in your suppositions about my origin, and that my father's standing even in the society in which he now moved, what that was best known to myself, was eminently superior and was acknowledged by everyone. Quite accurate, rejoined Mrs. Myrtle. A most admirable memory. Thank you, ma'am. Perhaps you'll be so kind as to tell my sister the rest. There is very little to tell, said Mrs. Myrtle, reviewing the breadth of bosom which seemed essential to her having room enough to be unfeeling in. But it is to your sister's credit. I pointed out to your sister the plain state of the case, the impossibility of the society in which we moved recognizing the society in which she moved, though charming. I have no doubt the immense disadvantage at which she would consequently place the family she had so high an opinion of, upon which we should find ourselves compelled to look down with contempt, and from which, socially speaking, we should feel obliged to recoil with abhorrence. In short, I made an appeal to that laudable pride in your sister. Let my sister know, if you please, Mrs. Myrtle, Fanny pouted, with a toss of her gauzy bonnet, that I had already had the honour of telling your son that I wished to have nothing whatever to say to him. Well, Miss Dorrit, assented Mrs. Myrtle, perhaps I might have mentioned that before. If I did not think of it, perhaps it was because my mind reverted to the apprehensions I had at the time that he might persevere and you might have something to say to him. I also mentioned to your sister, I again addressed the non-professional Miss Dorrit, that my son would have nothing in the event of such a marriage and would be an absolute beggar. I mention that merely as a fact which is part of the narrative, and not as supposing it to have influenced your sister, except in the prudent and legitimate way in which, constituted as our artificial system is, we must all be influenced by such considerations. Finally, after some high words and high spirits on the part of your sister, we came to the complete understanding that there was no danger, and your sister was so obliging as to allow me to present her with a mark or two of my appreciation at my dressmaker's. Little Dorrit looked sorry, and glanced at Fanny with a troubled face. Also, said Mrs. Myrtle, as to promise to give me the present pleasure of a closing interview, and of parting with her on the best of terms, on which occasion, added Mrs. Myrtle, quitting her nest and putting something in Fanny's hand, Miss Dorrit will permit me to say farewell with best wishes in my own dull manner. The sisters rose at the same time, and they all stood near the cage of the parrot, as he tore at a claw full of biscuit and spat it out, seemed to mock them with a pompous dance of his body without moving his feet, and suddenly turned himself upside down and trailed himself all over the outside of his golden cage, with the aid of his cruel beak and black tongue. Adieu, Miss Dorrit, with best wishes, said Mrs. Myrtle. If we could only come to a millennium or something of that sort, I for one might have the pleasure of knowing a number of charming and talented persons from whom I am at present excluded. A more primitive state of society would be delicious to me. There used to be a poem when I learnt lessons, something about, lo, the poor Indians whose something mind. If a few thousand persons moving in society could only go and be Indians, I would put my name down directly, but as moving in society, we can't be Indians, unfortunately. Good morning. They came downstairs with powder before them and powder behind, the elder sister haughty and the younger sister humbled, and were shut out into unpowdered Harley Street, Cavendish Square. Well, said Fanny, when they had gone a little way without speaking, have you anything to say, Amy? Oh, I don't know what to say, she answered, distressed. You don't like this young man, Fanny? Like him? He is almost an idiot. I'm so sorry, don't be hurt, but since you ask me what I have to say, I am so very sorry, Fanny, that you have suffered this lady to give you anything. You little fool, returned her sister, shaking her with the sharp pull she gave her arm. Have you no spirit at all? But that's just the way. You have no self-respect. You have no becoming pride, just as you allow yourself to be followed about by a contemptible little chivery of a thing, with the scornfullest emphasis. You would let your family be trodden and never turn. Don't say that, dear Fanny. I do what I can for them, repeated Fanny, walking her on very fast. Would you let a woman like this, whom you could see, if you had any experience of anything, to be as false and insolent as a woman can be, would you let her put her foot upon your family and thank her for it? No, Fanny, I am sure. Then make her pay for it, you mean little thing. What else can you make her do? Make her pay for it, you stupid child, and do your family some credit with the money. They spoke no more all the way back to the lodging where Fanny and her uncle lived. When they arrived there, they found the old man practising his clarionet in the dolefullest manner in a corner of the room. Fanny had a composite meal to make of chops and porter and tea, and indignantly pretended to prepare it for herself, though her sister did all that in quiet reality. When at last Fanny sat down to eat and drink, she threw the table implements about and was angry with her bread, much as her father had been last night. "If you despise me," she said, bursting into vehement tears, "because I am a dancer, why did you put me in the way of being one? It was your doing. You would have me stoop as low as the ground before this Mrs. Myrtle, and let her say what she liked and do what she liked, and hold us all in contempt, and tell me so to my face, because I am a dancer. Oh, Fanny! And Tip, too, poor fellow. She is to disparage him just as much as she likes, without any check, I suppose because he has been in the law and the docks and different things. Why, it was your doing, Amy. You might at least approve of his being defended." All this time the uncle was dolefully blowing his clarionet in the corner, sometimes taking it an inch or so from his mouth for a moment while he stopped to gaze at them, with a vague impression that somebody had said something. "And your father, your poor father, Amy, because he is not free to show himself and to speak for himself, you would let such people insult him with impunity? If you don't feel for yourself because you go out to work, you might at least feel for him, I should think, knowing what he has undergone so long." Poor little Dorrit felt the injustice of this taunt rather sharply. The remembrance of last night added a barbed point to it. She said nothing in reply, but turned her chair from the table towards the fire. Uncle, after making one more pause, blew a dismal wail and went on again. Fanny was passionate with the teacups and the bread as long as her passion lasted, and then protested that she was the wretchedest girl in the world, and she wished she was dead. After that, her crying became remorseful, and she got up and put her arms round her sister. Little Dorrit tried to stop her from saying anything, but she answered that she must. Thereupon she said again and again, "I beg your pardon, Amy," and "Forgive me, Amy," almost as passionately as she had said what she regretted. "But indeed, Amy," she resumed, when they were seated in sisterly accord side by side, "I hope and I think you would have seen this differently if you had known a little more of society." "Perhaps I might, Fanny," said the mild little Dorrit. "You see, while you have been domestic and resignedly shut up there, Amy," pursued her sister, gradually beginning to patronize, "I have been out, moving more in society, and may have been getting proud and spirited, more than I ought to be, perhaps." Little Dorrit answered, "Yes, oh yes. And while you have been thinking of the dinner or the clothes, I may have been thinking, of the family. Now, may it not be so, Amy?" Little Dorrit again nodded, "Yes," with a more cheerful face than heart. "Especially as we know," said Fanny, "that there certainly is a tone in the place to which you have been so true, which does belong to it, and which does make it different from other aspects of society. So kiss me once again, Amy dear, and we will agree that we may both be right, and that you are a tranquil, domestic, home-loving, good girl." The clarionet had been lamenting most pathetically during this dialogue, but was cut short now by Fanny's announcement that it was time to go, which she conveyed to her uncle by shutting up his scrap of music and taking the clarionet out of his mouth. Little Dorrit parted from them at the door and hastened back to the Marshalsea. It fell dark there sooner than elsewhere, and going into it that evening was like going into a deep trench. The shadow of the wall was on every object, not least upon the figure in the old grey gown and the black velvet cap, as it turned towards her when she opened the door of the dim room. "Why not upon me too?" thought Little Dorrit, with the door yet in her hand. It was not unreasonable in Fanny. Chapter 21. Mr. Myrtle's Complaint. Upon that establishment of state, the Myrtle establishment in Harley Street, Cavendish Square, there was the shadow of no more common wall than the fronts of other establishments of state on the opposite side of the street. Like unexceptionable society, the opposing rows of houses in Harley Street were very grim with one another. Indeed, the mansions and their inhabitants were so much alike in that respect that the people were often to be found drawn up on opposite sides of dinner tables, in the shade of their own loftiness, staring at the other side of the way with the dullness of the houses. Everybody knows how like the street the two dinner rows of people who take their stand by the street will be. The expressionless uniform 20 houses, all to be knocked at and rung at in the same form, all approachable by the same dull steps, all fended off by the same pattern of railing, all with the same impracticable fire escapes, the same inconvenient fixtures in their heads, and everything without exception to be taken at a high valuation, which has not dined with these. The house so drearily out of repair, the occasional bow window, the stuccoed house, the newly fronted house, the corner house with nothing but angular rooms, the house with the blinds always down, the house with the hatchment always up, the house where the collector has called for 1/4 of an idea and found nobody at home, who has not dined with these? The house that nobody will take, and is to be had a bargain, who does not know her? The showy house that was taken for life by the disappointed gentleman, and which does not suit him at all, who is unacquainted with that haunted habitation? Harley Street, Cavendish Square, was more than aware of Mr. and Mrs. Myrtle. Intruders there were in Harley Street, of whom it was not aware, but Mr. and Mrs. Myrtle it delighted to honour. Society was aware of Mr. and Mrs. Myrtle. Society had said, "Let us license them, let us know them." Mr. Myrtle was immensely rich, a man of prodigious enterprise, a Midas without the ears, who turned all he touched to gold. He was in everything good, from banking to building. He was in Parliament, of course. He was in the City, necessarily. He was chairman of this, trustee of that, president of the other. The weightiest of men had said to projectors, "Now, what name have you got? Have you got Myrtle?" And the reply being in the negative had said, "Then I won't look at you." This great and fortunate man had provided that extensive bosom which required so much room to be unfeeling enough in, with a nest of crimson and gold some 15 years before. It was not a bosom to repose upon, but it was a capital bosom to hang jewels upon. Mr. Myrtle wanted something to hang jewels upon, and he bought it for the purpose. Storr and Mortimer might have married on the same speculation. Like all his other speculations, it was sound and successful. The jewels showed to the richest advantage. The bosom moving in society with the jewels displayed upon it attracted general admiration. Society approving, Mr. Myrtle was satisfied. He was the most disinterested of men, did everything for society, and got as little for himself out of all his gain and care as a man might. That is to say, it may be supposed that he got all he wanted, otherwise, with unlimited wealth, he would have got it. But his desire was to the utmost to satisfy society, whatever that was, and take up all its drafts upon him for tribute. He did not shine in company, he had not very much to say for himself, he was a reserved man, with a broad, overhanging, watchful head, that particular kind of dull red colour in his cheeks which is rather stale than fresh, and a somewhat uneasy expression about his coat cuffs, as if they were in his confidence, and had reasons for being anxious to hide his hands. In the little he said, he was a pleasant man enough, plain, emphatic about public and private confidence, and tenacious of the utmost deference being shown by everyone in all things to society. In this same society, if that were it which came to his dinners, and to Mrs. Myrtle's receptions and concerts, he hardly seemed to enjoy himself much, and was mostly to be found against walls and behind doors. Also, when he went out to it, instead of its coming home to him, he seemed a little fatigued, and upon the whole rather more disposed for bed, but he was always cultivating it nevertheless, and always moving in it, and always laying out money on it with the greatest liberality. Mrs. Myrtle's first husband had been a colonel, under whose auspices the bosom had entered into competition with the snows of North America, and had come off at little disadvantage in point of whiteness, and at none in point of coldness. The colonel's son was Mrs. Myrtle's only child. He was of a chuckle-headed, high-shouldered make, with the general appearance of being not so much a young man as a swelled boy. He had given so few signs of reason that a byword went among his companions that his brain had been frozen up in a mighty frost which prevailed at St. John's, New Brunswick, at the period of his birth there, and had never thawed from that hour. Another byword represented him as having in his infancy, through the negligence of a nurse, fallen out of a high window on his head, which had been heard by responsible witnesses to crack. It is probable that both these representations were of ex post facto origin, the young gentleman, whose expressive name was Sparkler, being monomaniacal in offering marriage to all manner of undesirable young ladies, and in remarking of every successive young lady to whom he tendered a matrimonial proposal, that she was a deuced fine gal, well educated too, with no by-God nonsense about her. A son-in-law with these limited talents might have been a clog upon another man, but Mr. Myrtle did not want a son-in-law for himself. He wanted a son-in-law for society. Mr. Sparkler, having been in the Guards, and being in the habit of frequenting all the races and all the lounges and all the parties, and being well known, society was satisfied with its son-in-law. This happy result Mr. Myrtle would have considered well attained, though Mr. Sparkler had been a more expensive article. And he did not get Mr. Sparkler by any means cheap for society, even as it was. There was a dinner-giving in the Harley Street establishment, while little Dorrit was stitching at her father's new shirts by his side that night, and there were magnates from the court and magnates from the city, magnates from the commons and magnates from the lords, magnates from the bench and magnates from the bar, bishop magnates, treasury magnates, horse guard magnates, admiralty magnates, all the magnates that keep us going and sometimes trip us up. "I am told," said Bishop Magnate to horse guards, "that Mr. Myrtle has made another enormous hit. They say £100,000. Horse guards had heard 2. Treasury had heard 3. Bar, handling his persuasive double eyeglass, was by no means clear but that it might be 4. It was one of those happy strokes of calculation and combination, the result of which it was difficult to estimate. It was one of those instances of a comprehensive grasp associated with habitual luck and characteristic boldness, of which an age presented us but few. But here was Brother Bellows, who had been in the great bank case, and who could probably tell us more. What did Brother Bellows put this new success at? Brother Bellows was on his way to make his bow to the bosom, and could only tell them in passing that he had heard it stated with great appearance of truth as being worth, from first to last, £500,000 of money. Admiralty said Mr. Myrtle was a wonderful man. Treasury said he was a new power in the country, and would be able to buy up the whole House of Commons. A bishop said he was glad to think that this wealth flowed into the coffers of a gentleman who was always disposed to maintain the best interests of society. Mr. Myrtle himself was usually late on these occasions, as a man still detained in the clutch of giant enterprises when other men had shaken off their dwarfs of the day. On this occasion, he was the last arrival. Treasury said Myrtle's work punished him a little. Bishop said he was glad to think that this wealth flowed into the coffers of a gentleman who accepted it with meekness. Powder. There was so much powder in waiting that it flavoured the dinner. Pulverous particles got into the dishes, and society's meats had a seasoning of first-rate footmen. Mr. Myrtle took down a countess who was secluded somewhere in the core of an immense dress, to which she was in the proportion of the heart to the overgrown cabbage. If so low a simile may be admitted, the dress went down the staircase like a richly brocaded jack in the green, and nobody knew what sort of small person carried it. Society had everything it could want and could not want for dinner. It had everything to look at, and everything to eat, and everything to drink. It is to be hoped it enjoyed itself, for Mr. Myrtle's own share of the repast might have been paid for with 18 pence. Mrs. Myrtle was magnificent. The Chief Butler was the next magnificent institution of the day. He was the stateliest man in the company. He did nothing, but he looked on as few other men could have done. He was Mr. Myrtle's last gift to society. Mr. Myrtle didn't want him, and was put out of countenance when the great creature looked at him, but inappeasable society would have him, and had got him. The invisible countess carried out the green at the usual stage of the entertainment, and the file of beauty was closed up by the bosom. Treasury said Juno, Bishop said Judith. Bar fell into discussion with horse guards concerning courts-martial. Brothers Bellows and Bench stuck in. Other magnates paired off. Mr. Myrtle sat silent and looked at the tablecloth. Sometimes a magnate addressed him, to turn the stream of his own particular discussion towards him, but Mr. Myrtle seldom gave much attention to it, or did more than rouse himself from his calculations and pass the wine. When they rose, so many of the magnates had something to say to Mr. Myrtle individually that he held little levees by the sideboard and checked them off as they went out at the door. Treasury hoped he might venture to congratulate one of England's world-famed capitalists and merchant princes. He had turned that original sentiment in the House a few times, and it came easy to him on a new achievement. To extend the triumphs of such men was to extend the triumphs and resources of the nation, and Treasury felt, he gave Mr. Myrtle to understand, patriotic on the subject. "Thank you, my lord," said Mr. Myrtle. "Thank you. I accept your congratulations with pride, and I am glad you approve." "Why, I don't unreservedly approve, my dear Mr. Myrtle, because," smiling Treasury turned him by the arm towards the sideboard and spoke banteringly, "it never can be worth your while to come among us and help us." Mr. Myrtle felt honoured by the "No, no," said Treasury. "That is not the light in which one so distinguished for practical knowledge and great foresight can be expected to regard it. If we should ever be happily enabled, by accidentally possessing the control over circumstances, to propose to one so eminent to come among us and give us the weight of his influence, knowledge, and character, we could only propose it to him as a duty, in fact, as a duty that he owed to society." Mr. Myrtle intimated that society was the apple of his eye, and that its claims were paramount to every other consideration. Treasury moved on, and Bar came up. Bar, with his little insinuating jury droop and fingering his persuasive double eyeglass, hoped he might be excused if he mentioned to one of the greatest converters of the root of all evil into the root of all good, who had for a long time reflected a shining lustre on the annals even of our commercial country, if he mentioned disinterestedly and as what we lawyers called in our pedantic way amicus curiae, a fact that had come by accident within his knowledge. He had been required to look over the title of a very considerable estate in one of the eastern counties, lying, in fact, for Mr. Myrtle knew we lawyers loved to be particular, on the borders of two of the eastern counties. Now, the title was perfectly sound, and the estate was to be purchased by one who had the command of money, jury droop and persuasive eyeglass, on remarkably advantageous terms. This had come to Bar's knowledge only that day, and it had occurred to him, I shall have the honour of dining with my esteemed friend Mr. Myrtle this evening, and strictly between ourselves, I will mention the opportunity. Such a purchase would involve not only a great legitimate political influence, but some half-dozen church presentations of considerable annual value. Now, that Mr. Myrtle was already at no loss to discover means of occupying even his capital, and of fully employing even his active and vigorous intellect, Barr well knew, but he would venture to suggest that the question arose in his mind whether one who had deservedly gained so high a position and so European a reputation did not owe it, we would not say to himself, but we would say to society, to possess himself of such influences as these, and to exercise them, we would not say for his own or for his party's, but we would say for society's benefit. Mr. Myrtle again expressed himself as wholly devoted to that object of his constant consideration, and Barr took his persuasive eyeglass up the grand staircase. Bishop then came, undesignedly sidling in the direction of the sideboard. Surely the goods of this world, it occurred in an accidental way to Bishop to remark, could scarcely be directed into happier channels than when they accumulated under the magic touch of the wise and sagacious who, while they knew the just value of riches, Bishop tried here to look as if he were rather poor himself, were aware of their importance, judiciously governed and rightly distributed, to the welfare of our brethren at large. Mr. Myrtle, with humility, expressed his conviction that Bishop couldn't mean him, and with inconsistency expressed his high gratification in Bishop's good opinion. Bishop, then, jauntily stepping out a little with his well-shaped right leg, as though he said to Mr. Myrtle, "Don't mind the apron, a mere form," put this case to his good friend. Whether it had occurred to his good friend that society might not unreasonably hope that one so blessed in his undertakings, and whose example on his pedestal was so influential with it, would shed a little money in the direction of a mission or so to Africa? Mr. Myrtle signifying that the idea should have his best attention, Bishop put another case. Whether his good friend had at all interested himself in the proceedings of our combined additional endowed dignitaries committee, and whether it had occurred to him that to shed a little money in that direction might be a great conception finally executed. Mr. Myrtle made a similar reply, and Bishop explained his reason for inquiring. Society looked to such men as his good friend to do such things. It was not that he looked to them, but the society looked to them. Just as it was not our committee who wanted the additional endowed dignitaries, but it was society that was in a state of the most agonizing uneasiness of mind until it got them. He begged to assure his good friend that he was extremely sensible of his good friend's regard on all occasions for the best interests of society, and he considered that he was at once consulting those interests and expressing the feeling of society when he wished him continued prosperity, continued increase of riches, and continued things in general. Bishop, then, betook himself upstairs, and the other magnates gradually floated up after him until there was no one left below but Mr. Myrtle. That gentleman, after looking at the tablecloth until the soul of the chief butler glowed with a noble resentment, went slowly up after the rest, and became of no account in the stream of people on the grand staircase. Mrs. Myrtle was at home. The best of the jewels were hung out to be seen. Society got what it came for. Mr. Myrtle drank 2 pennyworth of tea in a corner, and got more than he wanted. Among the evening magnates was a famous physician who knew everybody and whom everybody knew. On entering at the door, he came upon Mr. Myrtle drinking his tea in a corner, and touched him on the arm. Mr. Myrtle started. "Oh, it's you. Any better today?" "No," said Mr. Myrtle, "I am no better." "A pity. I didn't see you this morning. Pray come to me tomorrow, or let me come to you." "Well," he replied, "I will come tomorrow as I drive by." Barr and Bishop had both been bystanders during this short dialogue, and as Mr. Myrtle was swept away by the crowd, they made their remarks upon it to the physician. Barr said there was a certain point of mental strain beyond which no man could go, that the point varied with various textures of brain and peculiarities of constitution, as he had had occasion to notice in several of his learned brothers, but the point of endurance passed by a line's breadth. Depression and dyspepsia ensued. Not to intrude on the sacred mysteries of medicine, he took it now, with the jury droop and persuasive eyeglass, that this was Myrtle's case. Bishop said that when he was a young man and had fallen for a brief space into the habit of writing sermons on Saturdays, a habit which all young sons of the church should sedulously avoid, he had frequently been sensible of a depression, arising, as he supposed, from an overtaxed intellect, upon which the yolk of a new-laid egg, beaten up by the good woman in whose house he had at the time lodged, with a glass of sound sherry, nutmeg, and powdered sugar, acted like a charm. Without presuming to offer so simple a remedy to the consideration of so profound a professor of the great healing art, he would venture to inquire whether the strain being by way of intricate calculations, the spirits might not, humanly speaking, be restored to their tone by a gentle and yet generous stimulant. "Yes," said the physician, "yes, you are both right, but I may as well tell you that I can find nothing the matter with Mr. Myrtle. He has the constitution of a rhinoceros, the digestion of an ostrich, and the concentration of an oyster. As to nerves, Mr. Myrtle is of a cool temperament and not a sensitive man. He is about as invulnerable, as I should say, as Achilles. How such a man should suppose himself unwell without reason, you may think strange, but I have found nothing the matter with him. He may have some deep-seated recondite complaint. I can't say. I only say that at present I have not found it out." There was no shadow of Mr. Myrtle's complaint on the bosom now displaying precious stones in rivalry with many similar superb jewel-stands. There was no shadow of Mr. Myrtle's complaint on young Sparkler, hovering about the rooms, monomaniacally seeking any sufficiently ineligible young lady with no nonsense about her. There was no shadow of Mr. Myrtle's complaint on the barnacles and the stilt-stalkings, of whom whole colonies were present, or on any of the company. Even on himself, its shadow was faint enough as he moved about among the throng, receiving homage. Mr. Myrtle's complaint. Society and he had so much to do with one another in all things else, that it is hard to imagine his complaint, if he had one, being solely his own affair. Had he that deep-seated recondite complaint, and did any doctor find it out? Patience. In the meantime, the shadow of the Marshalsea wall was a real darkening influence, and could be seen on the Dorrit family at any stage of the sun's course. Chapter 22. A Puzzle. Mr. Clennam did not increase in favour with the father of the Marshalsea in the ratio of his increasing visits. His obtuseness on the great testimonial question was not calculated to awaken admiration in the paternal breast, but had rather a tendency to give offence in that sensitive quarter, and to be regarded as a positive shortcoming in point of gentlemanly feeling. An impression of disappointment, occasioned by the discovery that Mr. Clennam scarcely possessed that delicacy for which, in the confidence of his nature, he had been inclined to give him credit, began to darken the fatherly mind in connection with that gentleman. The father went so far as to say, in his private family circle, that he feared Mr. Clennam was not a man of high instincts. He was happy, he observed, in his public capacity as leader and representative of the college, to receive Mr. Clennam when he called to pay his respects, but he didn't find that he got on with him personally. There appeared to be something, he didn't know what it was, wanting in him. Howbeit, the father did not fail in any outward show of politeness, but, on the contrary, honoured him with much attention, perhaps cherishing the hope that, although not a man of a sufficiently brilliant and spontaneous turn of mind to repeat his former testimonial unsolicited, it might still be within the compass of his nature to bear the part of a responsive gentleman in any correspondence that way tending. In the threefold capacity of the gentleman from outside who had been accidentally locked in on the night of his first appearance, of the gentleman from outside who had inquired into the affairs of the father of the Marshalsea with the stupendous idea of getting him out, and of the gentleman from outside who took an interest in the child of the Marshalsea, Clennam soon became a visitor of mark. He was not surprised by the attentions he received from Mr. Chivery when that officer was on the lock, for he made little distinction between Mr. Chivery's politeness and that of the other turnkeys. It was on one particular afternoon that Mr. Chivery surprised him all at once, and stood forth from his companions in bold relief. Mr. Chivery, by some artful exercise of his power of clearing the lodge, had contrived to rid it of all sauntering collegians, so that Clennam, coming out of the prison, should find him on duty alone. Private. "I ask your pardon, sir," said Mr. Chivery in a secret manner, "but which way might you be going?" "I am going over the bridge." He saw in Mr. Chivery with some astonishment quite an allegory of silence as he stood with his key on his lips. Private. "I ask your pardon again," said Mr. Chivery, "but could you go round by Horsemonger Lane? Could you by any means find some time to look in at that address?" Handing him a little card printed for circulation among the connection of Chivery and Co., tobacconists, importers of pure Havana cigars, Bengal cheroots, and fine-flavoured Cubas, dealers in fancy stuffs, etc., etc. Private. "It ain't tobacco business," said Mr. Chivery. "The truth is, it's my wife. She's wishful to say a word to you, sir, upon a point respecting—" "Yes," said Mr. Chivery, answering Clennam's look of apprehension with a nod. "Respecting her. I will make a point of seeing your wife directly." "Thank you, sir. Much obliged. It ain't above 10 minutes out of your way. Please to ask for Mrs. Chivery." These instructions Mr. Chivery, who had already let him out, cautiously called through a little slide in the outer door, which he could draw back from within for the inspection of visitors when it pleased him. Arthur Clennam, with the card in his hand, betook himself to the address set forth upon it, and speedily arrived there. It was a very small establishment, wherein a decent woman sat behind the counter working at her needle. Little jars of tobacco, little boxes of cigars, a little assortment of pipes, a little jar or two of snuff, and a little instrument like a shoeing horn for serving it out, composed the retail stock in trade. Arthur mentioned his name and his having promised to call on the solicitation of Mr. Chivery. About something relating to Miss Dorrit, he believed. Mrs. Chivery at once laid aside her work, rose up from her seat behind the counter, and deploringly shook her head. "You may see him now," said she, "if you'll condescend to take a peep." With these mysterious words, she preceded the visitor into a little parlour behind the shop, with a little shadow in it commanding a very little dull backyard. In this yard, a wash of sheets and tablecloths tried, in vain for want of air, to get itself dried on a line or two, and among those flapping articles was sitting in a chair, like the last mariner left alive on the deck of a damp ship, without the power of furling the sails, a little woe-begone young man. "Our John," said Mrs. Chivery. Not to be deficient in interest, Clennam asked what he might be doing there. "It's the only change he takes," said Mrs. Chivery, shaking her head afresh. "He won't go out, even in the backyard, when there's no linen, but when there's linen to keep the neighbours' eyes off, he'll sit there hours. Hours he will. Says he feels as if it was groves." Mrs. Chivery shook her head again, put her apron in a motherly way to her eyes, and reconducted her visitor into the regions of the business. "Please to take a seat, sir," said Mrs. Chivery. "Miss Dorrit is the matter with our John, sir. He's a breaking his heart for her, and I would wish to take the liberty to ask how it's to be made good to his parents when bust." Mrs. Chivery, who was a comfortable-looking woman much respected about Horsemonger Lane for her feelings and her conversation, uttered this speech with fell composure, and immediately afterwards began again to shake her head and dry her eyes. "Sir," she said in continuation, You are acquainted with the family, and have interested yourself with the family, and are influential with the family. If you can promote views calculated to make two young people happy, let me, for our John's sake, and for both their sakes, implore you so to do." "I have been so habituated," returned Arthur, at a loss, "during the short time I have known her, to consider little— I have been so habituated to consider Miss Dorrit in a light altogether removed from that in which you present her to me, that you quite take me by surprise. Does she know your son?" "Brought up together, sir," said Mrs. Chivery. "Played together." "Does she know your son as an admirer?" "Oh, bless you, sir," said Mrs. Chivery, with a sort of triumphant shiver, "she never could have seen him on a Sunday without knowing he was that. His cane alone would have told it long ago, if nothing else had. Young men like John don't take to ivory hands a-pinting for nothing. How did I first know it myself? Similarly. Perhaps Miss Dorrit may not be so ready as you see." "Then she knows it, sir," said Mrs. Chivery, "by word of mouth." "Are you sure?" "Sir," said Mrs. Chivery, "sure and certain as in this house I am. I see my son go out with my own eyes when in this house I was, and I see my son come in with my own eyes when in this house I was, and I know he done it." Mrs. Chivery derived a surprising force of emphasis from the foregoing circumstantiality and repetition. "May I ask how he came to fall into the desponding state which causes you so much uneasiness?" "That," said Mrs. Chivery, "took place on that same day when to this house I see that John with these eyes returned. Never been himself in this house since. Never was like he has been since, not from the hour when to this house 7 year ago me and his father, as tenants by the quarter, came." An effect in the nature of an affidavit was gained from this speech by Mrs. Chivery's peculiar power of construction. "May I venture to inquire what is your version of the matter?" "You may," said Mrs. Chivery, "and I will give it to you in honour and in word as true as in this shop I stand. Our John has everyone's good word and everyone's good wish. He played with her as a child when in that yard a child she played. He has known her ever since. He went out upon the Sunday afternoon when in this very parlour he had dined and met her, with appointment or without appointment, which I do not pretend to say. He made his offer to her. Her brother and sister is high in their views and against our John. Her father is all for himself in his views and against all sharing her with anyone. Under which circumstances she has answered our John, 'No, John, I cannot have you. I cannot have any husband. It is not my intentions ever to become a wife. It is my intentions to be always a sacrifice. Farewell, find another worthy of you, and forget me.' This is the way in which she is doomed to be a constant slave to them that are not worthy that a constant slave she unto them should be. This is the way in which our John has come to find no pleasure but in taking cold among the linen, and in showing in that yard, as in that yard I have myself shown you, a broken-down ruin that goes home to his mother's heart." Here the good woman pointed to the little window whence her son might be seen sitting disconsolate in the tuneless groves, and again shook her head and wiped her eyes, and besought him, for the united sakes of both the young people, to exercise his influence towards the bright reversal of these dismal events. She was so confident in her exposition of the case, and it was so undeniably founded on correct premises in so far as the relative positions of little Dorrit and her family were concerned, that Clennam could not feel positive on the other side. He had come to attach to little Dorrit an interest so peculiar, an interest that removed her from, while it grew out of, the common and coarse things surrounding her, that he found it disappointing, disagreeable, almost painful to suppose her in love with young Chivery in the backyard or any such person. On the other hand, he reasoned with himself that she was just as good and just as true in love with him as not in love with him, and that to make a kind of domesticated fairy of her, on the penalty of isolation at heart from the only people she knew, would be but a weakness of his own fancy, and not a kind one. Still, her youthful and ethereal appearance, her timid manner, the charm of her sensitive voice and eyes, the very many respects in which she had interested him out of her own individuality, and the strong difference between herself and those about her were not in unison, and were determined not to be in unison with this newly presented idea. He told the worthy Mrs. Chivery, after turning these things over in his mind, he did that, indeed, while she was yet speaking, that he might be relied upon to do his utmost at all times to promote the happiness of Miss Dorrit, and to further the wishes of her heart, if it were in his power to do so, to discover what they were. At the same time, he cautioned her against assumptions and appearances, enjoined strict silence and secrecy, lest Miss Dorrit should be made unhappy, and particularly advised her to endeavour to win her son's confidence, and so to make quite sure of the state of the case. Mrs. Chivery considered the latter precautions superfluous, but said she would try. She shook her head as if she had not derived all the comfort she had fondly